Hello. Welcome to Storytime with Moog. I am Moog, and today we are reading The Trial by Franz Kafka. But first, reading updates. I am very, very close to finishing Poor Things, and I'm still liking it. I am liking it more than the movie. The ending is different, but it still leaves me. So I left the movie feeling unsure if I liked it. I'm leaving the book feeling like I enjoy it more than the book, but unsure about everything else. Like I'm unsure if like it's something that I mean, I'll definitely remember it. Definitely, definitely. But I don't know if it's something that's like, yeah, this was like a really good book. Like it's super, super easy to talk about. There's so many things in it, so many themes that are presented in such a way that lends itself to conversation and to debate, which is pretty awesome. But do I enjoy it? I mean, the very last bit that I've read, yes. Everything else, I'm not sure. I'm not sure, but the very last bit also like makes it like puts things in a different perspective, which is pretty nice. But that's all I'm reading right now. I have like 6 poetry books that I checked out. I don't read poetry, but I was like, it's poetry month. I should read some poetry, and I'm not going to read poetry. I'm just kidding myself with that. So I'm just gonna return them. I think I read like one poem, but I think I'm just gonna return them all and just move on. But other than that, that is all I am. Oh, no, that's not all I'm currently reading. I'm also reading Knife by Salman Rushdie. I'm not very far into it. I haven't read more from the last time I talked about it, but I am also enjoying that one as well. Okay, I think that's it. Now I think that's it. All right, so I did pull up some notes. And by saying pull up some notes, I mean I pulled up the Wikipedia page specifically for The Trial. So it says The Trial, originally published in German as Der Prozess, is a novel written by Franz Kafka in 1914 and 1915 and published posthumously in on 26 April 1925. One of the best-known works, it tells the story of Josef K, a man arrested and prosecuted by a remote, inaccessible authority, with the nature of his crime revealed neither to him nor to the reader. Heavily influenced by Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment and the brothers Karamazov, Karamazov. Kafka even went so far as to call Dostoevsky a blood relative. Like Kafka's two other novels, The Castle and America, the trial was never completed, although it does include a chapter which appears to bring the story to an intentionally abrupt ending. Ooh. After Kafka's death in 1924, his friend and literary executor Max Brod edited the text for publication by Verlag die Schmiede. That's in German. The original manuscript is held at the Museum of Modern Literature, Marbach am Neckar, Germany. The first English language translation by Willa and Edwin Muir was published in 1937. In 1999, the book was listed in Le Monde's 100 Books of the Century and as number 2 of the best German novels of the 20th century. So, pretty well known. I didn't know that it wasn't completed before he died. That's kind of cool. We'll see how it goes. Here we go. Here we go. It is a different setup. I will have it on my reader next time. All right, so The Trial by Franz Kafka. Chapter 1. Arrest. Conversation with Mrs. Grubach. Then Miss Bursner. Someone must have been telling lies about Joseph K. He knew he had done nothing wrong, but one morning he was arrested. Every day at 8 in the morning he was brought his breakfast by Mrs. Grubach's cook. Mrs. Grubach was his landlady, but today she didn't come. That had never happened before. Kay waited a little while, looked from his pillow at the old woman who lived opposite, and who was watching him with an inquisitiveness quite unusual for her, and finally, both hungry and disconcerted, rang the bell. There was immediately a knock at the door, and a man entered. He had never seen the man in his house before. He was slim, but firmly built. His clothes were black and close-fitting, with many folds and pockets, buckles and buttons and a belt, all of which gave the impression of being very practical, but without making it very clear what they were actually for. "Who are you?" asked Kay, sitting half upright in his bed. The man, however, ignored the question, as if his arrival simply had to be accepted, and merely replied, "You rang." "Anna should have brought me my breakfast," said Kay. He tried to work out who the man actually was, first in silence, just through observation and by thinking about it, but the man didn't stay still to be looked at for very long. Instead, he went over to the door, opened it slightly, and said to someone who was clearly standing immediately behind it, "He wants Anna to bring him his breakfast." There was a little laughter in the neighboring room. It was not clear from the sound of it whether there were several people laughing. The strange man could not have learned anything from it that he hadn't already known, but now he said to Kay, as if making his report, "It is not possible." "It would be the first time that's happened," said Kay, as he jumped out of bed and quickly pulled on his trousers. "I want to see who that is in the next room, and why it is that Mrs. Grubach has let me be disturbed in this way." It immediately occurred to him that he needn't have said this aloud, and that he must have some extent have acknowledged their authority by doing so, but that didn't seem important to him at the time. That, at least, is how the stranger took it, as he said, "Don't you think you'd better stay where you are?" "I want neither to stay here nor to be spoken to you until you've introduced yourself." "I mean it for your own good," said the stranger, and opened the door, this time without being asked. The next room, which Kay entered more slowly than he had intended, looked at first glance exactly the same as it had the previous evening. It was Mrs. Grubach's living room, overfilled with furniture, tablecloths, porcelain, and photographs. Perhaps there was a little more space in there than usual today, but if so, it was not immediately obvious, especially as the main difference was the presence of a man sitting by the open window with a book from which he now looked up. "You should have stayed in your room. Didn't Franz tell you?" "And what is it you want, then?" said Kay, looking back and forth between his new acquaintance and the one named Franz, who had remained in the doorway. Through the open window he noticed the old woman again, who had come close to the window opposite so that she could continue to see everything. She was showing an inquisitiveness that really made it seem like she was going senile. "I want to see Mrs. Grubach," said Kay, making a movement as if tearing himself away from the two men, even though they were standing well away from him and wanted to go. "No," said the man at the window, who threw his book down on a coffee table and stood up. "You can't go away when you're under arrest." "That's how it seems," said Kay. "And why am I under arrest?" he then asked. "That's something we're not allowed to tell you. Go into your room and wait there. Proceedings are underway, and you'll learn about everything in good time. It's not really part of my job to be friendly towards you like this, but I hope no one, apart from Franz, will hear about it. And he's been more friendly towards you than he should have been, under the rules, himself. If you carry on having as much good luck as you have been with your arresting officers, then you can reckon on things going well with you." Kay wanted to sit down, but then he saw that, apart from the chair by the window, there was nowhere anywhere in the room where he could sit. "You'll get the chance to see for yourself how true all this is," said Franz, and both men then walked up to Kay. They were significantly bigger than him, especially the second man, who frequently slapped him on the shoulder. The two of them felt Kay's nightshirt, and said he would now have to wear that one that was of much lower quality, but that they would keep the nightshirt along with his other underclothes and return them to him if his case turned out well. "It's better for you if you don't give us the things than if you leave them in the storeroom," they said. "Things have a tendency to go missing in the storeroom, and after a certain amount of time they'll sell things off, whether the case involved has come to an end or not. And cases like this can last a long time, especially the ones that have been coming up lately. They'd give you the money they got for them, but it wouldn't be very much, as it's not that they're offered for them when they sell them that counts. It's how much they get slipped on the side, and things like that lose their value anyway when they get passed on from hand to hand, year after year." Kay paid hardly any attention to what they were saying. He did not place much value on what he may have still possessed, or on who decided what happened to them. It was much more important to him to get a clear understanding of his position, but he could not think clearly while these people were here. The second policeman's belly, and they could only be policemen, looked friendly enough, sticking out towards him, but when Kay looked up and saw his dry, bony face, it did not seem to fit with the body. His strong nose twisted to one side as if ignoring Kay, and sharing in understanding with the other policemen. What sort of people were these? What were they talking about? What office did they belong to? Kay was living in a free country, after all. Everywhere was at peace, all laws were decent, and were upheld. Who was it who dared accost him in his own house? He was always inclined to take life as lightly as he could, to cross bridges when he came to them, pay no heed for the future when everything seemed under threat. But here that did not seem the right thing to do. He could have taken it all as a big joke set up by his colleagues at the bank for some unknown reason, or perhaps because today was his 30th birthday. It was all possible, of course. Maybe all he had to do was laugh in the policeman's face in some way, and they would laugh with him. Maybe they were tradesmen from the corner of the street. They looked like they might be, but he was nonetheless determined, ever since he first caught sight of the one called Franz, not to lose any slight advantage he might have had over these people. There was a very slight risk that people would later say he couldn't understand a joke, but although he wasn't normally in the habit of learning from experience, he might also have had a few unimportant occasions in mind when, unlike his more cautious friends, he had acted with no thought at all for what might follow, and had been made to suffer for it. He didn't want that to happen again. Not this time, at least. If they were play acting, he would act along with them. He still had time. "Allow me," he said, and hurried between the two policemen through into his room. "He seems sensible enough," he heard them say behind him. Once in his room, he quickly pulled open the drawer of his writing desk. Everything in it was very tidy, but in his agitation he was unable to find the identification documents he was looking for straight away. He finally found his bicycle permit and was about to go back to the policeman with it when it seemed to him too petty. So he carried on searching until he found his birth certificate. Just as he got back in the adjoining room, the door on the other side opened, and Mrs. Grubach was about to enter. He only saw her for an instant, for as soon as she recognized Kay, she was clearly embarrassed, asked for forgiveness, and disappeared, closing the door behind her very carefully. Do come in, Kay could have just said then. But now he stood in the middle of the room with his papers in his hand, and still looking at the door, which did not open again. He stayed like that until he was startled out of it by the shout of the policeman who sat at the little table at the open window and, as Kay now saw, was eating his breakfast. "Why didn't she come in?" he asked. "She's not allowed to," said the big policeman. "You're under arrest, aren't you?" "But how can I be under arrest? And how come it's like this?" "Now you're starting again," said the policeman, dipping a piece of buttered bread in the honey pot. "We don't answer questions like that." "You'll have to answer them," said Kay. "Here are my identification papers. Now show me yours, and I certainly want to see the arrest warrant." "Oh, my God," said the policeman. "In a position like yours, and you think you can start giving orders, do you? It won't do you any good to get us on the wrong side. Even if you think it will, we're probably more on your side than anyone else you know." "That's true, you know. You'd better believe it," said Franz, holding a cup of coffee in his hand, which he did not lift it to his mouth, but looked at Kay in a way that was probably meant to be full of meaning, but could not actually be understood. Kay found himself, without intending it, in a mute dialogue with Franz, but then slapped his hand down on his papers and said, "Here are my identity papers." "And what do you want us to do about it?" replied the big policeman, loudly. "The way you're carrying on, it's worse than a child. What is it you want? Do you want to get this great bloody trial of yours over with quickly by talking about ID and arrest warrants with us? We're just coppers, and that's all we are. Junior officers like us hardly know one end of an ID card from another. All we've got to do with you is keep an eye on you for 10 hours a day and get paid for it. That's all we are. Mind you, what we can do is make sure that the high officials we work for find out just what sort of person it is they're going to arrest, and why he should be arrested, before they issue the warrant. There's no mistake there. Our authorities, as far as I know, and I only know the lowest grades, don't go out looking for guilt among the public. It's the guilt that draws them out, like it says in the law, and they have to send us police officers out. That's the law. Where do you think there'd be any mistake there?" "I don't know this law," said Kay. "So much the worse for you, then," said the police officer. "It probably exists only in your heads," said Kay. He wanted, in some way, to insinuate his way into the thoughts of the policeman, to reshape those thoughts to his benefit, or to make himself at home there. But the policeman just said dismissively, "You'll find out when it affects you." Franz joined in and said, "Look at this, Willem. He admits he doesn't know the law and at the same time insists he's innocent." "You're quite right, and he can't get him to understand a thing," said the other. Kay stopped talking with them. He thought to himself, do I really have to carry on getting tangled up with the chattering of base functionaries like this? And they admit themselves that they are the lowest position. They're talking about things of which they don't have the slightest understanding anyway. It's only because of their stupidity that they're able to be so sure of themselves. I just need few words with someone of the same social standing as myself, and everything will be comparably clearer. Much clearer than a long conversation with these two can make it. He walked up and down the free space in the room a couple times. Across the street, he could see the old woman who, now, had pulled an old man, much older than himself, up to the window and had her arms around him. Kay had put an end to this display. "Take me to your superior," he said. "As soon as he wants to see you, not before," said the policeman, the one called Willem. "And now my advice to you," he added, "is to go into your room, stay calm and wait, and see what's to be done with you. If you take our advice, you won't tire yourself out thinking about things to no purpose. You need to pull yourself together, as there's a lot that's going to be going to required of you. You've not behaved towards us the way we deserve after being so good to you. You forget that we, whatever we are, we're still free men, and you're not. And that's quite an advantage. But in spite of all that, you're still willing, if you've got the money, to go and get some breakfast from the cafe over the road. Without giving any answer to this officer, Kay stood still for some time. Perhaps, if he opened the door of the next room, or even the front door, the two of them would not dare to stand in his way. Perhaps that would be the simplest way to settle the whole thing, by bringing it to a head. But maybe they would grab him. And if he were thrown down on the ground, he would lose all the advantage he, in a certain respect, had over them. So he decided on the more certain solution, the way things would go in the natural course of events, and went back to his room without another word, either from him or from the policeman. He drew himself down on his bed, and from the dressing table he took the nice apple that he had put there the previous evening for his breakfast. Now, it was all the breakfast he had, and anyway, as he confirmed as soon as he took his first big bite of it, it was far better than the breakfast he could have had through the good will of the policeman from the dirty cafe. He felt well and confident. He had failed to go into work at the bank this morning, but that could easily be excused because of the relatively high position he held there. Should he really send in his explanation? He wondered about it. If nobody believed him, and in this case that would be understandable, he could bring Mrs. Grubach in as a witness, or even the old pair from across the street, who probably even now were on their way over to the window opposite. It puzzled Kay. At least it puzzled him, looking at it from the policeman's point of view, that they had made him go into the room and left him alone there, where he had 10 different ways of killing himself. At the same time, though, he asked himself, this time looking at it from his own point of view, what reason he could have to do so. Because these two were sitting there in the next room and had taken his breakfast, perhaps. It would have been so pointless. Even if he wanted to, the pointlessness would have made him unable. Maybe, if the policemen had not been so obviously limited in their mental abilities, it could have been supposed that they had come to the same conclusion and saw no danger in leaving him alone because of it. They could watch him now, if they wanted, and see how he went over to the cupboard in the wall where he kept a bottle of good schnapps, how he first emptied a glass of it in place of his breakfast, and how he then took a second glassful in order to give himself courage. The last one just as a precaution for the unlikely chance it would be needed. Then he was so startled by a shout to him from the other room that he struck his teeth against the glass. "The supervisor wants to see you," the voice said. It was only the shout that startled him, this curt, abrupt, military shout that he would not have expected from the policeman called Franz. In itself, he found the order very welcome. "At last," he called back, locked the cupboard, and, without delay, hurried into the next room. The two policemen were standing there and chased him back into his bedroom, as if that were a matter of course. "What do you think you're doing?" they cried. "Think you're gonna see the supervisor dressed in just your shirt, do you? He'd see to it you got a right thumping, and us and all." "Let go of me, for God's sake," cried Kay, who had already been pushed back as far as his wardrobe. "If you accost me, then I'm still in bed. You can't expect to find me in my evening dress." "That won't help you," said the policeman, who always became very quiet, almost sad, when Kay began to shout, and in that way confused him, or, to some extent, brought him to his senses. "Ridiculous formalities," he grumbled, as he lifted his coat from the chair and kept it in both his hands for a little while, as if holding it out for the policeman's inspection. They shook their heads. "It's got to be a black coat," they said. At that, Kay threw the coat to the floor and said, without knowing, even himself, what he meant by it, "Well, it's not going to be the main trial, after all." The policeman laughed, but continued to insist. "It's got to be a black coat." "Well, it's all right by me if it makes things go any faster," said Kay. He opened the wardrobe himself, spent a long time searching through all the clothes, and chose his best black suit, which had a short jacket that had greatly surprised those who knew him. Then he also pulled out a fresh shirt and began, carefully, to get dressed. He secretly told himself that he had succeeded in speeding things up by letting the policeman forget to make him have a bath. He watched them to see if they might remember, after all. But of course, it never occurred to them, although Willem did not forget to send Franz up to the supervisor with the message saying that Kay was getting dressed. Once he was properly dressed, Kay had to pass by Willem as he went through the next room into the one beyond, the door of which was already wide open. Kay knew very well that this room had recently been let to a typist called Miss Burstner. She was in the habit of going out to work very early and coming back home very late, and Kay had never exchanged more than a few words of greeting with her. Now, her bedside table had been pulled into the middle of the room to be used as a desk for those proceedings, and the supervisor sat behind it. He had his legs crossed, and had thrown one arm over the backrest of the chair. In one corner of the room, there were 3 young people looking at the photographs belonging to Miss Burster that had been put into a piece of fabric on the wall. Hung up on the handle of the open window was a white blouse. At the window across the street there was the old pair again, although now their number had increased, as behind them, and far taller than they were, stood a man with an open shirt that showed his chest and a reddish goatee beard, which he squeezed and twisted with his fingers. "Josef K?" asked the supervisor, perhaps merely to attract Kay's attention as he looked around the room. Kay nodded. "I dare say you are quite surprised by all that's been taking place this morning," said the supervisor, as, with both hands, he pushed away the few items of the bedside table, the candle and box of matches, a book and a pin-cushion, which lay there as if they were things he would need for his own business. "Well, certainly," said Kay, and he began to feel relaxed now that, at last, he stood in front of someone with some sense, someone with whom he would be able to talk about this situation. "Certainly I'm surprised, but not in any way very surprised." "You're not very surprised?" asked the supervisor, as he positioned the candle in the middle of the table and the other things in a group around it. "Perhaps you don't quite understand me," Kay hurriedly pointed out. "What I mean is—" Here, Kay broke off what he was saying and looked round for somewhere to sit. "I may sit down, mayn't I?" he asked. "That's not usual," the supervisor answered. What I mean is," said Kay without delaying a second time, "that yes, I am very surprised, but when you've been in the world for 30 years already and had to make your own way through everything yourself, which has been my lot, then you become hardened to surprises and don't take them too hard. Especially not what's happened today." "Why especially not what's happened today?" "I wouldn't want to say that I see all this as a joke. You seem to have gone to too much trouble making all these arrangements for that. Everyone in the house must be taking part in it as well as all of you. That would be going beyond what could be a joke. So I don't want to say that this is a joke." "Quite right," said the supervisor, looking to see how many matches were left in the box. "But on the other hand," Kay went on, looking around at everyone there, and even wishing he could get the attention of the 3 who were looking at the photographs, "on the other hand, this really can't be all that important. That follows from the fact that I've been indicted, but can't think of the slightest offense for which I could be indicted. But even that is all beside the point. The main question is, Who is issuing the indictment? What office is conducting this affair? Are you officials? None of you is wearing a uniform, unless what you are wearing, here he turned towards Franz, is meant to be a uniform. It's actually more of a traveling suit. I require a clear answer to all these questions, and I'm quite sure that once things have been made clear, we can take our leave of each other on the best terms. The supervisor slammed the box of matches down on the table. You're making a big mistake, he said. These gentlemen and I have got nothing to do with your business. In fact, we know almost nothing about you. We could be wearing uniforms as proper and exact as you like, and your situation wouldn't be any the worse for it. As to whether you are on a charge, I can't give you any sort of clear answer to that. I don't even know whether you are or not. You're under arrest. You're quite right about that, but I don't know any more than that. Maybe these officers have been chit-chatting with you. Well, if they have, that's all it is, chit-chat. I can't give you an answer to your questions, but I can give you a bit of advice. You'd better think less about us and what's going to happen to you, and think a bit more about yourself. And stop making all this fuss about your sense of innocence. You don't make such a bad impression, but with all this fuss you're damaging it, and you ought to do a bit less talking, too. Almost everything you've said so far has been things we could have taken from your behavior, even if you'd said no more than a few words, and what you have said has not exactly been in your favor. Kay stared at the supervisor. Was this man, probably younger than he was, lecturing him like a schoolmaster? Was he being punished for his honesty, with a telling off? And was he to learn nothing about the reasons for his arrest or those who were arresting him? He became somewhat cross and began to walk up and down. No one stopped him doing this, and he pushed his sleeves back, felt his chest, straightened his hair, went over to the three men and said, "It makes no sense." At which these three turned round to face him and came towards him with serious expressions. He finally came again to a halt in front of the supervisor's desk. State Attorney Hasterer is a good friend of mine, he said. Can I telephone him? Certainly, said the supervisor, but I don't know what the point of that will be. I suppose you must have some private matter you want to discuss with him. What the point is? Shouted Kay, more disconcerted than cross. Who do you think you are? You want to see some point in it while you're carrying out something as pointless as it could be? It's enough to make you cry. These gentlemen first accost me, and now they sit or stand about in here and let me be hauled up in front of you? What point there would be in telephoning a state attorney when I'm ostensibly under arrest? Very well. I won't make the telephone call. You can call him if you want to, said the supervisor, stretching his hand out towards the outer room where the telephone was. Please, go on. Do make your phone call. No, I don't want to anymore, said Kay, and went over to the window. Across the street, the people were still there at the window, and it was only now that Kay had gone up to his window that they seemed to become uneasy about quietly watching what was going on. The old couple wanted to get up, but the man behind them calmed them down. We've got some kind of audience over there, called Kay to the supervisor quite loudly, as he pointed out with his forefinger. Go away. He then called across to them, and the three of them did immediately retreat a few steps. The old pair even found themselves behind the man, who then concealed them with the breath of his body, and seemed, going by the movement of his mouth, to be saying something incomprehensible into the distance. They did not disappear entirely, though, but seemed to be waiting for the moment when they could come back to the window without being noticed. Intrusive, thoughtless people, said Kay, as he turned back into the room. The supervisor may have agreed with him. At least Kay thought that was what he saw from the corner of his eye, but it was just as possible that he had not even been listening, as he had his hand pressed firmly down on the table and seemed to be comparing the length of his fingers. The two policemen were sitting on a chest covered with a colored blanket, rubbing their knees. The three young people had put their hands on their hips and were looking round aimlessly. Everything was still, like in some office that had been forgotten about. Now, gentlemen, called out Kay, and for a moment it seemed as if he was carrying all of them on his shoulders. It looks like your business with me is over with. In my opinion, it's best now to stop wondering about whether you're proceeding correctly or incorrectly, and to bring the matter to a peaceful close with a mutual handshake. If you are of the same opinion, then please. And he walked up to the supervisor's desk, held out his hand to him. The supervisor raised his eyes, bit his lip, and looked at Kay's outstretched hand. Kay still believed the supervisor would do as he suggested, but instead he stood up, picked up a hard, round hat that was lying on Miss Burstner's bed, and put it carefully onto his head, using both hands as if trying on a new hat. "Everything seems so simple to you, doesn't it?" he said to Kay, as he did so. "So you think you could bring the matter to a peaceful close, do you?" No, that won't do. Mind you, on the other hand, I certainly wouldn't want you to think there's no hope for you. No, why should you think that? You're simply under arrest, nothing more than that. That's what I had to tell you. That's what I've done, and now I've seen how you've taken it. That's enough for one day, and we can take our leave of each other, for the time being at least. I expect you'll want to go back to the bank now, won't you?" "Into the bank?" asked Kay. "I thought I was under arrest." Kay said this with a certain amount of defiance, as, although his handshake had not been accepted, he was feeling more independent of all these people, especially since the supervisor had stood up. He was playing with them. If they left, he had decided he would run after them and offer to let them arrest him. That's why he even repeated, "How can I go to the bank when I'm under arrest?" I see you've misunderstood me," said the supervisor, who was already at the door. "It's true that you are under arrest, but that shouldn't stop you from carrying on your job. And there shouldn't be anything to stop you carrying on with your usual life." "In that case, it's not too bad being under arrest," said Kay, and went up close to the supervisor. "I never meant it should be anything else," he replied. "It hardly seems to have been necessary to notify me of the arrest in that case," said Kay, and went even closer. The others had also come closer. All of them had gathered together into a narrow space by the door. "That was my duty," said the supervisor. "A silly duty," said the supervisor. "Oh, wait, no. A silly duty," said Kay, unyielding. "Maybe so," replied the supervisor. "Only don't let's waste our time talking on like this. I had assumed you'd be wanting to go back to the bank. As you are paying close attention to every word, I'll add this. I'm not forcing you to go to the bank. I just assumed you wanted to. And to make things easier for you, and to let you get to the bank with as little fuss as possible, I've put these three gentlemen colleagues of yours at your disposal." "What's that?" exclaimed Kay, and looked at the three in astonishment. He could only remember seeing them in their group by the photographs, but these characterless, anemic young people were indeed officials from his bank, not colleagues of his. That was putting it too high, and it showed a gap in the omniscience of the supervisor. But they were, nonetheless, junior members of staff at the bank. How could Kay have failed to see that? How occupied he must have been with the supervisor and the policeman not to have recognized these three. Habensteiner, with his stiff demeanor and swinging hands, Kullak, with his blonde hair and deep-set eyes, and Kaminer, with his involuntary grin caused by chronic muscle spasms. "Good morning," said Kay after a while, extending his hand to the gentleman as they bowed correctly to him. "I didn't recognize you at all. So, we'll go into work now, shall we?" The gentleman laughed and nodded enthusiastically, as if that was what they had been waiting for all the time. Except that Kay had left his hat in his room, so that all dashed, one after another, into the room to fetch it, which caused a certain amount of embarrassment. Kay stood where he was and watched them go through the open double door. The last to go, of course, was the apathetic Rabensteiner, who had broken into no more than an elegant trot. Kaminer got to the hat, and Kay, as he often had to do at the bank, forcibly reminded himself that the grin was not deliberate, but that he, in fact, wasn't able to grin deliberately. At that moment, Mrs. Grubach opened the door from the hallway into the living room where all the people were. She did not seem to feel guilty about anything at all, and Kay, as often before, looked down at the belt of her apron, which, for no reason, cut so deeply into her hefty body. Once downstairs, Kay, with his watch in his hand, decided to take a taxi. He had already been delayed by half an hour, and there was no need to make the delay any longer. Kaminer ran to the corner to summon it, and the two others were making obvious efforts to keep Kay diverted when Kullak pointed to the doorway of the house on the other side of the street, where the large man with the blonde goatee beard appeared, and, a little embarrassed at first at letting himself be seen in his full height, stepped back to the wall and leant against it. The old couple were probably still on the stairs. Kay was cross with Kullak for pointing out this man whom he had already seen himself, in fact, whom he had been expecting. "Don't look at him," he snapped, without noticing how odd it was to speak to free men in this way. But there was no explanation needed, anyway, as just then the taxi arrived. They sat inside and set off. Inside the taxi, Kay remembered that he had not noticed the supervisor and the policeman leaving. The supervisor had stopped him noticing the three bank staff, and now the three bank staff had stopped him from noticing the supervisor. This showed that Kay was not very attentive, and he resolved to watch himself more carefully in this respect. Nonetheless, he gave it no thought as he twisted himself round and leant over into the rear shelf of the car to catch sight of the supervisor and the policeman, if he could. But he turned back round straight away and leant comfortably into the corner of the taxi without even having made the effort to see anyone, although it did not seem like it. Now was just the time when he needed some encouragement. But the gentleman seemed tired just then. Rabensteiner looked out of the car to the right, Kullak to the left, and only Kaminer was there with his grin at Kay's service. It would have been inhumane to make fun of that. That spring, whenever possible, Kay usually spent his evenings after work, usually stayed in the office until 9 o'clock, with a short walk, either by himself or in the company of some of the bank officials, and then he would go into a pub where he would sit at the regulars' table with mostly older men until 11. There were, however, also exceptions in his habit, times, for instance, when Kay was invited by the bank's manager, whom he greatly respected for his industry and trustworthiness, to go with him for a ride in his car or to eat dinner with him at his large house. Kay would also go, once a week, to see a girl called Elsa, who worked as a waitress in a wine bar through the night until late in the morning. During the daytime, she only received visitors while still in bed. That evening, though, the day had passed quickly with a lot of hard work and many respectful and friendly birthday greetings. Kay wanted to go straight home. Each time he had any small break from the day's work, he considered, without knowing exactly what he had in mind, Mrs. Grubach's flat seemed to have put into great disarray by the events of that morning, and that it was up to him to put it back into order. Once order had been restored, every trace of those events would have been erased, and everything would take its previous course once more. In particular, there was nothing to fear from the three bank officials. They had immersed themselves back into their paperwork, and there was no alteration to be seen in them. Kay had called each of them, separately or all together, into his office that day for no other reason than to observe them. He was also satisfied, and had always been able to let them go again. At 9:30 that evening, when he arrived back in front of the building where he lived, he met a young lad in the doorway who was standing there, his legs apart, and smoking his pipe. "Who are you?" immediately asked Kay, bringing his face close to the lad's, as it was hard to see in the half-light of the landing. "I'm the landlord's son, sir," answered the lad, taking the pipe from his mouth and stepping to one side. "The landlord's son?" asked Kay, and impatiently knocked on the ground with his stick. "Did you want anything, sir? Would you like me to fetch my father?" "Oh, no, no," said Kay. There was something forgiving in his voice, as if the boy had harmed him in some way, and he was excusing him. "All right," he said then, and went on, but before going up the stairs he turned round once more. He could have gone directly to his room, but as he wanted to speak with Mrs. Grubach, he went straight to her door and knocked. She was at the table with a knitted stocking and a pile of old stockings in front of her. Kay apologized, a little embarrassed at coming so late, but Mrs. Grubach was very friendly and did not want to hear an apology. She was always ready to speak to him. He knew very well that he was her best and most favorite tenant. Kay looked round the room. It looked exactly as it usually did. The breakfast dishes, which had been on the table by the window that morning, had already been cleared away. A woman's hands will do many things when no one's looking, he thought. He might himself have smashed all the dishes on the spot, but certainly would not have been able to carry it all out. He looked at Mrs. Grubach with some gratitude. "Why are you working so late?" he asked. They were now both sitting at the table, and Kay now and then sank his hands into the pile of stockings. "There's a lot of work to do," she said. "During the day I belong to the tenants. If I'm to sort out my own things, there are only the evenings left to me. I fear I may have caused you some exceptional work today." "How do you mean, Mr. K?" she asked, becoming more interested and leaving her work in the lap. "I mean the men who were here this morning." "Oh, I see," she said, and went peacefully back to what she was doing. "That was no trouble. Not especially." Kay looked on in silence as she took up the knitted stocking once more. She seemed surprised at my mentioning it, he thought. She seemed to think it's improper for me to mention it. All the more important for me to do so. An old woman is the only person I can speak about with. "But it must have caused some work for you," he said then. "But it won't happen again." "No, it can't happen again," she agreed, and smiled at Kay in a way that was almost pained. "Do you mean that seriously?" asked Kay. "Yes," she said more gently. "But the important thing is you mustn't take it too hard. There are so many awful things happening in the world. As you're being so honest with me, Mr. K, I can admit to you that I listened to a little of what was going on from behind the door, and that those two policemen told me one or two things as well. It's all to do with your happiness, and that's something that's quite close to my heart. Perhaps more than it should be, as I am, after all, only your landlady. Anyway, so I heard one or two things, but I can't hardly say that it's about anything very serious. No, you have been arrested, but it's not the same way as when they arrest a thief. If you're arrested in the same way as a thief, then it's bad, but an arrest like this, it seems to me that it's something very complicated. Forgive me if I'm saying something stupid, something very complicated that I don't understand, but something that you don't really need to understand anyway." "There's nothing stupid about what you've said, Mrs. Grubach. Or at least I partly agree with you. Only, the way I judge the whole thing is harsher than yours, and think it's not only not something complicated, but simply a fuss about nothing. I was just caught unawares. That's what happened. If I had got up as soon as I was awake without letting myself get confused because Anna wasn't there, if I had got up and paid no regard to anyone who might have been in my way and come straight to you, if I'd done something like having my breakfast in the kitchen as an exception, asked you to bring my clothes from my room, in short, if I had behaved sensibly, then nothing more would have happened. Everything that was waiting to happen would have been stifled. People are so often unprepared. In the bank, for example. I am well prepared. Nothing of the sort could possibly happen to me there. I have my own assistants there. There are telephones for internal and external calls in front of me on the desk. I continually receive visits from people, representatives, officials, but besides that, and most importantly, I'm always occupied with my work. That's to say, I'm always alert. If it would even be a pleasure for me to find myself faced with something of that sort. But now it's over with, and I didn't really want to talk about it anymore. Only I wanted to hear what you, as a sensible woman, thought about it all, and I'm very glad to hear that we're in agreement. But now you must give me your hand. An agreement of this sort needs to be confirmed with a handshake. Will she shake hands with me? The supervisor didn't shake hands, he thought, and looked at the woman differently than before, examining her. She stood up, and, as he had also stood up, was a little self-conscious. She hadn't been able to understand everything that Kay had said. As a result of this self-consciousness, she said something that she certainly did not intend, and certainly was not appropriate. "Don't take it so hard, Mr. K," said she, with tears in her voice, and also, of course, forgetting the handshake. "I didn't know I was taking it hard," said Kay, feeling suddenly tired and seeing that if this woman did agree with him, it was of very little value. Before going out the door, he asked, "Is Miss Burstner home?" "No," said Mrs. Screwbach, smiling as she gave this simple piece of information, saying something sensible at last. "She's at the theater. Did you want to see her? Should I give her a message? I, I just wanted to have a few words with her. Well, I'm afraid I don't know when she's coming in. She usually gets back late when she's back to the theater." "Well, it doesn't really matter," said Kay, his head hanging as he turned to the door to leave. "I just wanted to give her my apology for taking over her room today." "There's no need for that, Mr. Kay. You're too conscientious. The young lady doesn't know anything about it. She hasn't been home since early the morning, and everything's been tidied up again. You can see for yourself." And she opened the door to Miss Burstner's room. "Thank you. I'll take your word for it," said Kay, but went, none the less, over to the open door. The moon shone quietly into the into the unlit room. As far as could be seen, everything was indeed in its place. Not even the house was hanging on the window handle. The pillows on the bed looked remarkably plump as they lay half in the moonlight. "Miss Burstner often comes home late," said Kay, looking at Mrs. Screwbach, as if they were her responsibility. "That's how young people are," said Mrs. Screwbach, to excuse herself. Of course," said Kay. "But it can be taken too far." "Yes, it can be," said Mrs. Screwbach. "You're so right, Mr. Kay. Perhaps it is in this case. I certainly wouldn't want to say anything nasty about Miss Burtner. She is a good, sweet girl, friendly, tidy, punctual, works hard. I appreciate all that very much, but one thing is true. She ought to have more pride. Be a bit less forthcoming. Twice this month already, in the street over the way, I've seen her with a different gentleman. I really don't like saying this. You're the only one I've said this to, Mr. K, I swear to God. But I'm going to have no choice but to have a few words with Miss Burtner's about it myself. And it's not the only thing about her that I'm worried about." "Mrs. Screwbach, you're on quite the wrong track," said Kay, so angry that he was hardly able to hide it. "And you have moreover misunderstood what I was saying about Miss Burstner. That is not what I meant. In fact, I warn you quite directly not to say anything to her. You are quite mistaken. I know Miss Burstner very well, and there's no truth at all in what you say. And what's more, perhaps I'm going too far. I don't want to get in your way. Say to her whatever you see fit. Good night." "Mr. K," said Miss Grubach, as if asking him for something and hurrying to his door, which he had already opened. "I don't want to speak to Miss Burstner at all, not yet. Of course, I'll continue to keep an eye on her, but you're the only one I've told what I know. And it is, after all, something that everyone who lets rooms has to do if she's to keep the house decent. That's all I'm trying to do." "Decent?" called out Kay through the crack in the door. "If you want to keep the house decent, you'll first have to give me notice." Then he slammed the door shut. There was a gentle knocking, to which he paid no more attention. He did not feel at all like going to bed, so he decided to stay up. And this would also give him the chance to find out when Miss Bursner would arrive home. Perhaps it would also still be possible, even if a little inappropriate, to have a few words with her. As he lay there by the window, pressing his hands to his tired eyes, he even thought for a moment that he might punish Mrs. Grubach for persuading Miss Bursner to give in her notice at the same time as he would. But he immediately realized that that would be shockingly excessive, and there would even be the suspicion that he was moving house because of the incidents of that morning. Nothing would have been more nonsensical, and, above all, more pointless and contemptible. When he had become tired of looking out onto the empty street, he slightly opened the door to the living room so that he could see anyone who entered the flat from where he was and lie down on the couch. He lay there, quietly smoking a cigar, until about 11 o'clock. He wasn't able to hold out longer than that, and went a little way into the hallway, as if, in that way, he could make Miss Bursner arrive sooner. He had no particular desire for her. He could not even remember what she looked like. But now he wanted to speak to her, and it irritated him that her late arrival home meant this day would be full of unease and disorder right to its very end. It was also her fault that he had not had any dinner that evening, and that he had been unable to visit Elsa as he had intended. He could still make up for both of those things, though, if he went to the wine bar where Elsa worked. He wanted to do so even later, after the discussion with Miss Bursner. It was already gone 11:30 when someone could be heard at the stairway. K, who had been lost in his thoughts in the hallway, walked up and down loudly, as if it were his own room, fled behind his door. Miss Bursner had arrived. Shivering, she pulled a silk shawl over her slender shoulders as she locked the door. The next moment she would certainly go into her room, where K ought not to intrude in the middle of the night. That meant he would have to speak to her now, but unfortunately he had not put the electric light on in his room, so that when he stepped out into the dark it would give the impression of being an attack, and would certainly, at the very least, have been quite alarming. There was no time to lose, and in his helplessness he whispered through the crack of the door, "Miss Bursner?" It sounded like he was pleading with her, not calling to her. "Is there someone there?" asked Miss Bursner, looking round with her eyes wide. "It's me," said Kay, and came out. "Oh, Mr. K," said Miss Bursner with a smile. "Good evening," and offered him her hand. "I wanted to give a word with you, if you would allow me." "Now?" asked Miss Bursner. "Does it have to be now? It is a little odd, isn't it?" "I've been waiting for you since 9 o'clock." "Well, I was at the theater. I didn't know anything about you waiting for me." "The reason I need to speak with you only came up today." I see. Well, I don't see why not. I suppose, apart from being so tired, I could drop. Come into my room for a few minutes, then. We certainly can't talk out here. We'd wake everyone up, and I think that would be more unpleasant for us than for them. Wait here till I've put the light on in my room, and then turn the light down out here." Kay did as he was told, and then even waited until Miss Bursner came out of her room and quietly invited him once more to come in. "Sit down," she said, indicating the ottoman, while she herself remained standing by the bedpost, despite the tiredness she had spoken of. She did not even take off her hat, which was small, but decorated with an abundance of flowers. "What is it you wanted, then? I'm really quite curious." She gently crossed her legs. "I expect you'll say," Kay began, "that the matter really isn't all that urgent, and we don't need to talk about it right now, but—" "I never listen to introductions," said Miss Bursner. "That makes my job so much easier," said Kay. "This morning, to some extent through my fault, your room was made a little untidy. This happened because of people I did not know and against my will, but, as I said, because of my fault. I wanted to apologize for it." "My room?" said Miss Bursner, and instead of looking around the room, scrutinized Kay. "It is true," said Kay, and now for the first time they looked at each other in the eye. "There is no point in saying exactly how this came about." "But that's the interesting thing about it," said Miss Bursner. "No," said Kay. "Well then," said Miss Bursner, I don't want to force my way into any secrets. If you insist that it's of no interest, I won't insist. I'm quite happy to forgive you for it, as you ask, especially as I can't see anything at all that's been left untidy. With her hand laid flat on her lower hip, she made a tour around the room. At the mat where the photographs were, she stopped. "Look at this!" she cried. "My photographs really have been put in the wrong places. Oh, that's horrible. Someone really has been in my room without permission." Kay nodded and quietly cursed Kaminer, who worked at his bank and who was always active doing things that had neither use nor purpose. "It is odd," said Miss Bursner, "that I'm forced to forbid you to do something that you ought to have forbidden yourself to do, namely to come into my room when I'm not here." "I did not expect it to you. I did explain to you," said Kay, and went over to join her by the photographs, "that it wasn't me who interfered with your photographs, but as you don't believe me, I'll have to admit that the investigating committee brought along 3 bank employees with them. One of them must have touched your photographs, and as soon as I get the chance, I'll ask to have him dismissed from the bank. Yes, there was an investigating committee here," said Kay, as the young lady was looking at him inquiring. "Because of you?" she asked. "Yes," answered Kay. "No!" the lady cried with a laugh. "Yes, they were," said Kay. "You believe that I am innocent, then, do you?" "Well, now, innocent," said the lady. "I don't want to start making any pronouncements that might have serious consequences. I don't really know you, after all. It means they're dealing with a serious criminal if they've sent an investigating committee straight out to get him. But you're not in custody now. At least I take it you've not escaped from prison, considering that you seem quite calm. So you can't have committed any crime of that sort." "Yes," said Kay. "But it might be that the investigating committee could see that I'm innocent, or not as guilty as had been supposed." "Yes, that's certainly a possibility," said Miss Bursner, who seemed very interested. "Listen," said Kay. "You don't have much experience in legal matters." "No, that's true, I don't," said Miss Bursner. "And I've often regretted it, as I'd like to know everything and I'm very interested in legal matters. There's something most peculiar, attractive about the law, isn't there? But I'll certainly be perfecting my knowledge in this area, as next month I start work in a legal office." "That's very good," said Kay. "That means you'll be able to give me some help with my trial." "That could well be," said Miss Bursner. "Why not? I like to make use of what I know." "I mean it quite seriously," said Kay. "Or at least half seriously, as you do. This affair is too petty to call in a lawyer, but I could make use of someone who could give me advice." "Yes, but if I'm to give you advice, I'll have to know what it's all about," said Miss Bursner. "That's exactly the problem," said Kay. "I don't know that myself." "So you have been making fun of me, then," said Miss Bursner, exceedingly disappointed. "You really ought not to try something like that on at this time of night." And she stepped away from the photographs where they had stood so long together. "Miss Bursner, no," said Kay. "I'm not making fun of you. Please believe me. I've already told you everything I know. More than I know, in fact, as it actually wasn't even an investigating committee. That's just what I called them because I don't know what else to call them. There was no cross committee at all. I was merely arrested, but by a committee." Miss Bursner sat on the ottoman and laughed again. "What was it like, then?" she asked. "It was terrible," said Kay. Although his mind was no longer on the subject, he had become totally absorbed by Miss Bursner's gaze, who was supporting her chin on one hand. The elbow rested on the cushion of the ottoman, and slowly stroking her hip with the other. "That's too vague," said Miss Bursner. What's too vague? What's too vague?" said Kay. Then he remembered himself and asked, "Would you like me to show you what it was like?" He wanted it to move in some way, but did not want to leave. "I'm already tired," said Miss Bursner. "You arrived back so late," said Kay. "Now you've started telling me off. Well, I suppose I deserve it, as I shouldn't have let you in here in the first place, and it turns out there wasn't even any point." "Oh, there was a point. You'll see now how important a point it was," said Kay. "May I move this table away from your bedside and put it here?" "What do you think you're doing?" said Miss Bursner. Of course you can't. In that case, I can't show you, said Kay, quite upset, as if Miss Bursner had committed some incomprehensible offense against him. All right, then. If you need it to show what you mean, just take the bedside table, then, said Miss Bursner, and after a short pause added in a weak voice, I'm so tired, I'm allowing more than I ought to. Kay put the little table in the middle of the room and sat down beside it. You have to get a proper idea of where the people were situated. It is very interesting. I'm the supervisor. Sitting over there on the chest are 2 policemen. Standing next to the photographs, there are 3 young people. Hanging on the handle of the window is a white blouse. I just mentioned that, by the way. And now it begins. Ah, yes, I'm forgetting myself. The most important person of all. So I'm standing here in front of the table. The supervisor is standing extremely comfortably with his legs crossed and his arms hanging over the backrest here like some layabout. And now it really does begin. The supervisor calls out as if he had to wake me up. In fact, he shouts at me. I'm afraid. If I'm to make it clear to you, I'll have to shout as well. And it's nothing more than my name if he shouts out. Miss Bursner, laughing as she listened to him, laid her forefinger on her mouth so that Kay would not shout. But it was too late. Kay was too engrossed in his role, and slowly called out, Josef K. It was not as loud as he had threatened, but nonetheless, once he had suddenly called it out, the cry seemed gradually to spread itself all around the room. There was a series of loud, curt, and regular knocks at the door of the adjoining room. Miss Bursner went pale and laid her hand on her heart. Kay was especially startled, as for a moment he had been quite unable to think of anything other than the events of that morning, and the girl for whom he was performing them. He had hardly pulled himself together when he jumped over to Miss Bursner and took her hand. Don't be afraid, he whispered. I'll put everything right, but who can it be? It's only the living room next door. Nobody sleeps in there. Yes, they do, whispered Miss Bursner into Kay's ear. A nephew of Miss Grubach's captain in the army has been sleeping there since yesterday. There's no other room free. I'd forgotten about it. Why did you have to shout like that? You've made me quite upset. There's no reason for it, said Kay, and now as she sank back into the cushion, kissed her forehead. Go away, she said hurriedly, sitting back up. Get out of here. Go. What is it that you want? He's listening at the door, and he can hear everything. You're causing me so much trouble. I won't go, said Kay, until you've calmed down a bit. Come over into the other corner of the room. He won't be able to hear us there. She let him lead her there. Don't forget, he said, although this might be unpleasant for you, you're not in any real danger. You know how much esteem Mrs. Grubach has for me. She's the one who will make all the decisions in this, especially as the captain is her nephew, but she believes everything I say without question. What's more, she has borrowed a large sum of money from me, and that makes her dependent on me. I will confirm whatever you say to explain our being here together, however inappropriate it might be, and I guarantee to make sure that Mrs. Gruber will not only say she believes the explanation in public, but will believe it truly and sincerely. You will have no need to consider me in any way. If you wish to let it be known that I have attacked you, then Mrs. Grubach will be informed of such, and she will believe it without even losing her trust in me. That's how much respect she has for me. Miss Bursner looked at the floor in front of her, quiet and a little sunk in on herself. Why would Mrs. Grubach not believe that I've attacked you? Added Kay. He looked at her hair in front of him, parted, bunched down, reddish and firmly held in place. He thought she would look up at him, but without changing her manner she said, Forgive me, but it was the suddenness of the knocking that startled me so much, not so much what the consequence of the captain being here might be. It was all so quiet after you shouted, and then there was knocking. That's what made me so shocked, and I was sitting right by the door. The knocking was right next to me. Thank you for your suggestions, but I won't accept them. I can bear the responsibility for anything that happens in my room myself, and I can do so with anyone. I'm surprised you don't realize just how insulting your suggestions are and what they imply about me. Although I certainly acknowledge your good intentions, but now, please, go. Leave me alone. I need you to go now, even more than I did earlier. The impulse of minutes you asked for has grown into half an hour, more than half an hour now. Kay took hold of her hand, and then of her wrist. You are not cross with me, though? He asked. She pulled her hand away and answered, No, no, I'm never cross with anyone. He grasped her wrist once more. She tolerated it now, and, in that way, led him to the door. He had fully intended to leave, but when he reached the door he came to a halt, as if he hadn't expected to find a door there. Miss Bursner made no ma- Miss Bursner made use of that moment to get herself free, open the door, slip out into the hallway, and gently say to Kay from there, Now, come along, please. Look. She pointed to the captain's door from under which there was a light shining. He's put a light out, and he's laughing at us. All right, I'm coming, said Kay. Moved forward, took hold of her, kissed her on the mouth, and then over her whole face like a thirsty animal, lapping with its tongue when it eventually finds water. He finally kissed her on the cheek and her throat, and left his lips pressed there for a long time. He did not look up until there was a noise from the captain's room. I'll go now, he said, and he wanted to address Miss Bursner by her Christian name, but did not know it. She gave him a tired nod, offered him her hand to kiss as she turned away, as if he did not know what she was doing, and went back into the room with her head bowed. A short while later, Kay was lying in his bed. He very soon went to sleep, but before he did, he thought a little while about his behavior. He was satisfied with it, but felt some surprise that he was not more satisfied. He was seriously worried about Miss Bursner because of the captain. End of chapter 1. Okay, so much happened in chapter 1. Okay, so we are introduced to Josef K, who is our main character, and he wakes up and there are officials there. Many, many men. And they're telling him that he is under arrest and he needs to get dressed and he needs to go do these things. And he's like, okay, but like, why am I arrested? Why am I being arrested? And they're like, well, we can't tell you that. And it's like, okay, but who knows why I'm arrested? Like, he's going back and forth and trying to get answers. And these officers are not providing any answers. They are not being helpful at all. And so he puts a suit on or gets dressed. I don't know if it's a suit. I don't remember. But he goes and gets dressed and goes to meet the supervisor. And the supervisor also doesn't give him answers. And it's just like, yeah, you're under arrest, but like, you can go off to the bank. And it's like, okay, I'm under arrest, but I'm not being held in prison. It's like, no, you're not a thief. Like, you're just under arrest. And it's like, okay, but like, what did I do? Like, why am I under arrest? Well, I can't tell you that. But don't worry about it. And so like Joseph is under arrest but still able to go about his day like regularly. What? And so he goes back home and he's trying to make sense of this with well, he doesn't go back home. He goes back to work to the bank that he works at, and there's the three like head honchos of the bank that were there this whole time that he just didn't realize. And so he's going off with them and he's just a little confused. And then he goes home at night and he's talking to his landlord, the landlady, and trying to make sense of things. And the landlady also is not helpful in being able to shed any light on anything. And it's just a very confusing, like circular, twisty conversation that he's having with everybody so far. And so he's going to talk to this other woman, Mrs. Brubach. No, I just combined two names. Bernstein. Burstner. There we go. Miss Burstner. And she comes home super, super late, but he still wants to talk to her. And so he goes and talks to her and like apologizes that her room got messed up, but then is decided but then is like, but your room was put back together, and like, let me tell you this thing. And she's like, oh, like legal interests, like legal things interest me, like maybe I can help. And he was like, that would be great because I don't think I need an actual lawyer, I just need advice. And she's like, okay, but like, what are you being charged with? And he's like, I don't know. And she's like, well, how am I supposed to help you if I don't even know what you're charged with? And he's like, that's a great question. And so it is like circular and like twisty, and we don't know what's going on. So even we as readers don't know why he's arrested or what he's being charged with or what he's done or anything like that, or who is doing the charging and who is doing the arresting, which is fun and interesting. Chapter 2. First cross-examination. Kay was informed by telephone that there would be a small hearing concerning his case the following Sunday. He was made aware that these cross-examinations would follow one another regularly, perhaps not every week, but quite frequently. On the one hand, it was in everyone's interest to bring proceedings quickly to their conclusions, but on the other hand, every aspect of the examinations had to be carried out thoroughly, without lasting too long because of the associated stress. For these reasons, it had been decided to hold a series of brief examinations following on one after another. Sundays had been chosen as the day for the hearing so that Kay would not be disturbed in his professional work. It was assumed that he would be in agreement with this, but if he wished for another date, then, as far as possible, he would be accommodated. Cross-examinations could even be held in the night, for instance, but Kay would probably not be fresh enough at that time. Anyway, as long as Kay made no objection, the hearing would be left on Sundays. It was a matter, of course, that he would have to appear without fail. There was probably no need to point this out. He would be given the number of buildings. He would be given the number of the building where he was to present himself, which was in a street in a suburb well away from the city center, which Kay had never been before. Once he had received this notice, Kay hung up the receiver without giving an answer. He had decided immediately to go there that Sunday. It was certainly necessary. Proceedings had begun, and he had to face up to it. And his first examination would probably also be the last. He was still standing in thought by the telephone when he heard the voice of the deputy director behind him. He wanted to use the telephone, but Kay stood in his way. Bad news? Asked the deputy director casually, not in order to find anything out, but just to get Kay away from the device. No, no, said Kay. He stepped to one side, but did not go away entirely. The deputy director picked up the receiver and, as he waited for his connection, turned away from it and said to Kay, "One question, Mr. Kay. Would you like to give me the pleasure of joining me on my sailing boat on Sunday morning? There's quite a few people coming. We're bound to know someone. You're bound to know some of them. One of them is Hasterer, the state attorney. Would you like to come along? Do come along." Kay tried to pay attention to what the deputy director was saying. It was of no small importance for him, as this invitation from the deputy director, with whom he had never got on very well, meant that he was trying to improve his relations with him. It showed how important Kay had become in the bank, and how its second most important official seemed to value his friendship, or at least his impartiality. He was also speaking at the side of the telephone receiver when he waited for his connection, but in giving this invitation the deputy director was humbling himself. But Kay would have to humiliate him a second time as a result. He said, "Thank you very much, but I'm afraid I will have no time on Sunday. I have a previous obligation." "Pity," said the deputy director, and turned to the telephone conversation that had just been connected. It was not a short conversation, but Kay remained standing, confused by the instrument all the time it was going on. It was only when the deputy director hung up that he was shocked into awareness and said, in order to partially excuse his standing there for no reason, "I've just received a telephone call. There's somewhere I need to go, but they forgot to tell me what time." Ask them, then, said the deputy director. It's not that important, said Kay, although in that way his earliest excuse, already weak enough, was made even weaker. As he went, the deputy director continued to speak about other things. Kay forced himself to answer, but his thoughts were mainly about that Sunday, how it would be best to get there for 9 o'clock in the morning, as that was the time that courts always start work on weekdays. The weather was dull on Sunday. Kay was very tired, and he had stayed out drinking until late in the night, celebrating with some of the regulars, and he had almost overslept. He dressed hurriedly, without the time to think and assemble the various plans he had worked out during the week. With no breakfast, he rushed to the suburb he had been told about. Oddly enough, although he had little time to look around him, he came across the 3 bank officials involved in his case: Rubensteiner, Kulik, and Kamener. The first 2 were traveling in a tram that went across Kay's route, but Kamener sat on the terrace of a cafe and leaned curiously over the wall as Kay came over. All of them seemed to be looking at him, surprised at seeing their superior running. It was a kind of pride that made Kay want to go on foot. This was his affair, and the idea of any help from strangers, however slight, was repulsive to him. He also wanted to avoid asking for anyone's help because that would initiate them into the affair, even if only slightly. And after all, he had no wish at all to humiliate himself before the committee by being too punctual. Anyway, now he was running so that he would get there by 9 o'clock, if at all possible, even though he had no appointment for this time. He had thought he would recognize the building from a distance by some kind of sign, without knowing exactly what the sign would look like, or from some particular kind of activity outside the entrance. Kay had been told about the building was in Juliusstrasse, but when he stood at the street's entrance, it consisted on each side of almost nothing but monotonous gray constructions, tall blocks of flats occupied by poor people. Now, on a Sunday morning, most of the windows were occupied. Men in their shirt sleeves leaned out smoking, or carefully and gently held small children on the sills. Other windows were piled up with bedding, above which the disheveled head of a woman could briefly appear. People called out to each other across the street. One of the calls provoked a loud laugh about Kay himself. It was a long street, and spaced evenly along it were small shops below street level, selling various kinds of foodstuffs, which you reached by going down a few steps. Women went in and out of them, or stood chatting on the steps. A fruitmonger, taking his goods up to the window, was just as inattentive as Kay, and nearly knocked him down with his cart. Just then, a gramophone, which in better parts of town would have been seen as worn out, began to play some murderous tune. Kay went farther into the street, slowly, as if he had plenty of time now, or as if the examining magistrate were looking at him from one of the windows and therefore knew that Kay had found his way there. It was shortly after 9. The building was quite far down the street. It covered so much area it was almost extraordinary, and the gateway in particular was tall and long. It was clearly intended for delivery wagons belonging to the various warehouses all round the yard, which were now locked up and carried the names of companies, some of which Kay knew from this work at the bank. In contrast with his usual habits, he remained standing a while at the entrance to the yard, taking in all these external details. Near him, there was a barefooted man sitting on a crate and reading a newspaper. There were 2 lads swinging on a handcart. In front of a pump stood a weak young girl in a bed jacket who, as the water flowed into her can, looked at Kay. There was a piece of rope stretched between 2 windows in a corner of the yard, with some washing hanging on it to dry. A man stood below it, calling out instructions to direct the work being done. Kay went over to the stairway to get to the room where the hearing was to take place, but then stood still again, as besides these steps he could see 3 other stairway entrances. and there also seemed to be a small passage at the end of the yard leading into a second yard. It irritated him that he had not been given more precise directions to the room. It meant they were either being especially neglectful with him or especially indifferent, and he decided to make that clear to them very loudly and very unambiguously. In the end, he decided to climb up the stairs, his thoughts playing on something that he remembered, the policeman, Willem, saying to him, that the court is attracted by the guilt, from which it followed that the courtroom must be on the stairway that K selected by chance. As he went up, he disturbed a large group of children playing on the stairs who looked at him as he stepped through their rows. Next time I come here, he said to himself, I must either bring sweets with me to make them like me, or a stick to hit them with. Just before he reached the first landing, he even had to wait a little while until a ball had finished its movement. Two small lads with sly faces like grown-up scoundrels held him by his trouser legs until it had. If he were to shake them off, he would have to hurt them, and he was afraid of what noise they would make by shouting. On the first floor, his search began for real. He still felt unable to ask for the investigating committee, and so he invented a joiner called Lance. That name occurred to him because the captain, Mrs. Grubach's nephew, was also called Lance. So he could ask at every flat whether Lance, the joiner, lived there, and thus obtain a chance to look into the rooms. It turned out, though, that was mostly possible without further ado, as almost all the doors were left open and the children ran in and out. Most of them were small, one-windowed rooms, where they also did the cooking. Many women held babies in one arm and worked at the stove with the other. Half-grown girls, who seemed to be dressed in just their pinafores, worked hardest running to and fro. In every room, the beds were still in use by people who were ill or still asleep, or people stretched out on them in their clothes. Kay knocked at the flats where the doors were closed and asked whether Lance, the joiner, lived there. It was usually a woman who opened the door, heard the inquiry, and turned to somebody in the room who would raise himself from the bed. The gentleman's asking if a joiner called Lance lived here. A joiner called Lance, he would ask from the bed. That's right, Kay would say, although it was clear that the investigating committee was not to be found there, and so his task was at an end. There were many who thought it must be important for Kay to find Lance, the joiner, and thought long about it, naming a joiner who was not called Lance, or giving a name that had some vague similarity with Lance, or they asked neighbors, or accompanied Kay to a door a long way away where they thought someone of some sort might live in the back part of the building, or where someone would be who could advise Kay better than they could themselves. Kay eventually had to give up asking if he did not want to be led all around from floor to floor in this way. He regretted his initial plan, which had at first seemed so practical to him. As he reached the 5th floor, he decided to give up the search, took his leave of a friendly young worker who wanted to lead him on still further, and went down the stairs. But then the thought of how much time he had wasted made him cross. He went back again and knocked at the first door of the 5th floor. The first thing he saw in the small room was a large clock on the wall, which already showed 10 o'clock. "Is there a joiner called Lance who lives here?" he asked. "Pardon?" said a young woman with black shining eyes, who was, at that moment, washing children's underclothes in a bucket. She pointed her wet hand towards the open door of the adjoining room. Kay thought he had stepped into a meeting. A medium-sized, two-windowed room was filled with the most diverse crowd of people. Nobody paid any attention to the person who had just entered. Close under its ceiling, it was surrounded by a gallery, which was also fully occupied, and where the people could only stand bent down with their heads and their hands touching the ceiling. Kay, who found the air too stuffy, stepped out again and said to the young woman who had probably misunderstood what he had said, "I asked for a joiner, someone by the name of Lance." "Yes," said the woman. "Please go on in." Kay would probably not have followed her if the woman had not gone up to him, taken hold of the door handle, and said, "I'll have to close the door after you. No one else will be allowed in." "Very sensible," said Kay, "but it's too full already." But then he went back in anyway. He passed through between two men who were talking beside the door. One of them held both hands far out in front of himself, making the movements of counting out money. The other looked him closely in the eyes, and someone took him by the hand. It was a small, red-faced youth. Come in," he said to Kay. Kay let himself be led by him, and he turned out there was, surprising, in a dense, packed crowd of people moving to and fro, a narrow passage which may have been the division between two factions. This idea was reinforced by the fact that in the first few rows to the left and the right of him there was hardly any face looking in his direction. He saw nothing but the backs of people directing their speech and their movements only towards members of their own side. Most of them were dressed in black, in long, old, formal frock coats that hung down loosely around them. These clothes were the only things that puzzled Kay, as he would otherwise have taken the whole assembly for a local political meeting. At the other end of the hall where Carrie had been led, there was a small little table set at an angle on a very low podium, which was as overcrowded as everything else. And behind the table, near the edge of the podium, sat a small, fat, wheezing man who was talking with someone behind him. This second man was standing with his legs crossed and his elbows on the backrest of the chair, provoking much laughter. From time to time he threw his arm in the air as if doing a caricature of someone. The youth who was leading Kay had some difficulty in reporting to the man. He had already tried twice to tell him something, standing on tiptoe, but without getting the man's attention as he sat there above him. It was only when one of the people up on the podium drew his attention to the youth that the man turned to him and leant down to hear what it was he quietly said. Then he pulled out his watch and quickly looked over at Kay. "You should have been here 1 hour and 5 minutes ago," he said to Kay, who was going to give him a reply but had no time to do so, as hardly had the man spoken than a general muttering arose all over the right-hand side of the hall. "You should have been here 1 hour and 5 minutes ago," the man now repeated, raising his voice this time, and quickly looked round the hall beneath him. The muttering also became immediately louder, and, as the man said nothing more, died away only gradually. Now the hall was much quieter than when Kay had entered. Only the people up in the gallery had not stopped passing remarks. As far as could be distinguished, up in the half-darkness, dust and haze, they seemed to be less well-dressed than those below. Many of them had brought pillows that they had put between their heads and the ceiling so that they would not hurt themselves pressed against it. Kay had decided he would do more watching than talking, so he did not defend himself for supposedly having come late, and simply said, "Well, maybe I have arrived late. I'm here now." There followed loud applause, once more from the right-hand side of the hall. Easy people to get on your side, thought Kay, and was bothered only by the quiet from the left-hand side, which was directly behind him, and from which there was applause from only a few individuals. He wondered what he could say to get all of them to support him together, or if that were not possible, to at least get the support of the people for a while. "Yes," said the man, "but I'm now no longer under any obligation to hear your case." There was once more a muttering, but this time it was misleading, as the man waved the people's objections aside with his hand and continued, "I will, however, as an exception, continue with it today. But you should never arrive late like this again. And now, step forward." Someone jumped down from the podium so that there would be a place free for Kay, and Kay stepped up into it. He stood, pressed closely against the table. The press of the crowd behind him was so great that he had to press back against it if he did not want to push the judge's desk down off the podium, and perhaps the judge along with it. The judge, however, paid no attention to that, but sat very comfortably on his chair, and after saying a few words to close his discussion with the man behind him, reached for a little notebook, the only item on his desk. It was like an old school exercise book, and had come quite misshapen from much thumbing. "Now then," said the judge, thumbing through the book. He turned to Kay, with the tone of someone who knows the facts, and said, "You are a house painter?" "No," said Kay. "I am the chief clerk of a large bank." This reply was followed by laughter among the right-hand faction down in the hall. It was so hearty that Kay couldn't stop himself joining in with it. The people supported themselves with their hands on their knees and shook as if suffering a serious attack of coughing. Even some of those in the gallery were laughing. The judge had become quite cross, but seemed to have no power over those below him in the hall. He tried to reduce what harm had been done in the gallery, and jumped up threatening them. His eyebrows, until then hardly remarkable, pushed themselves up and became big, black, and bushy over his eyes. The left-hand side of the hall was still quiet, though. The people stood there in rows with their faces looking towards the podium, listening to what was being said there. They observed the noise from the other side of the hall with the same quietness, and even allowed some individuals from their own ranks, here and there, to go forward into the other faction. The people in the left faction were not only fewer in number than the right, but probably were no more important than them, although their behavior was calmer, and that made it seem like they were. When Kay now began to speak, he was convinced he was doing it in the same way as them. "Your question, my lord, as to whether I am a house painter, in fact, even more than that, you did not ask at all but merely imposed it on me, is symptomatic of the whole way these proceedings against me are being carried out. Perhaps you will object that there are no proceedings against me. You will be quite right, as there are proceedings only if I acknowledge that there are. But for the moment I do acknowledge it, only of pity for yourself to a large extent. It's sometimes not to observe all this business without feeling pity. I don't say things are being done without due care, but I would like to make it clear that it is I who make the acknowledgement." Kay stopped speaking and looked down into the hall. He had spoken sharply, more sharply than he had intended, but he had been quite right. It should have been rewarded with some applause here and there, but everything was quiet. They were all clearly waiting for what would follow. Perhaps the quietness was laying the ground for an outbreak of activity that would bring this whole affair to an end. It was somewhat disturbing that just then the door at the end of the hall opened. The young washerwoman, who seemed to have finished her work, came in, and, despite all her caution, attracted the attention of some of the people there. It was only the judge who gave Kay any direct pleasure, as he seemed to have been immediately struck by Kay's words. Until then, he had listened to him standing, as Kay's speech had taken him by surprise, while he was directing his attention to the gallery. Now, in the pause, he sat down very slowly, as if he did not want anyone to notice. He took out the notebook again, probably so that he could give the impression of being calmer. "That won't help you, sir," continued Kay. "Even your little book will only confirm what I say." Kay was satisfied to hear nothing but his own quiet words in this room full of strangers, and he even dared casually to pick up the examining judge's notebook amid, and, touching it only with the tips of his fingers as if it were something revolting, lifted it into the air, holding it just by one of the middle pages so that the others on each side, closely written, blotted, and yellowing, flapped down. "Those are the official notes of the examining judge," he said, and let the notebook fall back onto the desk. "You can read in your book as much as you like, sir. I really don't have anything in this charge book to be afraid of, even though I don't have access to it as I wouldn't want it in my hand. I can only touch it with with 2 fingers. The judge grabbed the notebook from where it had fallen on the desk, which would only have been a sign of his deep humiliation, or at least that is how it must have been perceived, tried to tidy it up a little, and held it once more in front of him in order to read from it. The people in the front row looked at him, showing such tension on their faces that he looked back down at them for some time. Every one of them was an old man, some of them with white beards. Could they perhaps be the crucial group who could turn the whole assembly one way or the other? They had sunk into a state of motionlessness while Kay gave his oration, and it had not been possible to raise them from his passivity even when the judge was being humiliated. "What has happened to me," continued Kay, with less of the vigor he had earlier. He continually scanned the faces in the first row, and this gave his address a somewhat nervous and distracted character. "What has happened to me is not just an isolated case. If it were, it would not be of much importance, as it's not of much importance to me, but it is a symptom of proceedings which are carried out against many. It's on behalf of them that I stand here now, not for myself alone." Without having intended it, he had raised his voice. Somewhere in the hall, someone raised his hands and applauded him, shouting, "Bravo! Why not, then? Bravo! Again, I say bravo!" Some of the men in the first row groped around in their beards. None of them looked round to see who was shouting. Not even Kay thought him of any importance, but it did raise his spirits. He no longer thought it at all necessary that all of those in the hall should applaud him. It was enough if the majority of them began to think about the matter, if only one of them, now and then, was persuaded. "I'm not trying to be a successful orator," said Kay after his thought. "That's probably more than I'm capable of anyway. I'm sure the examining judge can speak far better than I. It is part of his job, after all. All that I want is a public discussion of a public wrong. Listen. 10 days ago, I was placed under arrest. The arrest itself is something I laugh about, but that's beside the point. They came for me in the morning when I was still in bed. Maybe the order had been given to arrest some house painter. That seems possible after what the judge has said. Someone who is as innocent as I am, but it was me they chose. They were 2 police thugs occupying the next room. They could not have taken better precautions if I had been a dangerous robber. And these policemen were unprincipled riffraff. They talked at me till I was sick of it. They wanted bribes. They wanted to trick me into giving them my clothes. They wanted money, supposedly, so that they could bring me my breakfast after they had blatantly eaten my own breakfast in front of my eyes. And even that was not enough. I was led in front of the supervisor in another room. Thus, this was the room of a lady who I have a lot of respect for, and I was forced to look on while the supervisor and the policeman made quite a mess of this room because of it, although not through any fault of mine. It was not easy to stay calm, but I managed to do so, and was completely calm when I asked the supervisor why it was that I was under arrest. If he were here, he would have to confirm what I say. I can see him now, sitting on the chair belonging to that lady I mentioned, a picture of dull-witted arrogance. What do you think he answered? What he told me, gentlemen, was basically nothing at all. Perhaps he really did know nothing. He had placed me under arrest and was satisfied. In fact, he had done more than that, and brought 3 junior employees from the bank where I work into the ladies' room. They had made themselves busy interfering with some photographs that belonged to the lady and causing a mess. There was, of course, another reason for bringing these employees. They, just like my landlady and her maid, were expecting to spread the news of my arrest and damage my public reputation, in no particular to remove me from my position in the bank. Well, they didn't succeed in any of that. Not in the slightest. Even my landlady, who is quite a simple person, and I will give you here her name in full respect. Her name is Mrs. Grubach. Even Mrs. Grubach was understanding enough to see that an arrest like this has no more significance than an attack carried out on a street by some youths who are not kept under proper control. I repeat, this whole affair has caused me nothing but unpleasantness and temporary irritation. But could it not have had some worse consequence? Kay broke off here and looked at the judge, who said nothing. As he did so, he thought he saw the judge use a movement of his eyes to give a sign to someone in the crowd. Kay smiled and said, "And now the judge, right next to me, is giving a secret sign to someone among you. There seems to be someone among you who is taking directions from above. I don't know whether the sign is meant to produce booing or applause, but I'll resist trying to guess what its meaning is too soon. It really doesn't matter to me, and I give his lordship the judge my full and public permission to stop giving secret signs to his paid subordinate down there, and give his orders in words instead. Let him just say, 'Boo now,' and then next time, 'Clap now.'" Whether it was embarrassment or impatience, the judge rocked back and forwards on his seat. The man behind him, whom he had been talking with earlier, leant forward again, either to give him a few general words of encouragement or some specific piece of advice. Below them in the hall, the people talked to each other quietly but animatedly. The two factions had earlier seemed to hold views strongly opposed to each other, but now they began to intermingle. A few individuals pointed up at Kay, others pointed at the judge. The air in the room was foggy and extremely oppressive. Those who were standing furthest away could hardly even be seen through it. It must have been especially troublesome for those visitors who were in the gallery, as they were forced to quietly ask the participants in the assembly what exactly was happening, albeit with timid glances at the judge. The replies they received were just as quiet and given behind the protection of a raised hand. "I have nearly finished what I have to say," said Kay, and as there was no bell available, he struck the desk with his fist in a way that startled the judge and his advisor, and made them look up from each other. None of this concerns me, and I am therefore able to make a calm assessment of it, and assuming that this so-called court is of any real importance, it will be very much to your advantage to listen to what I have to say. If you want to discuss what I say, please don't bother to write it down until later on. I don't have any time to waste, and I'll soon be leaving." There was immediate silence, which showed how well Kay was in control of the crowd. There were no shouts among them as there had been at the start. No one even applauded. But if they weren't already persuaded, they seemed very close to it. Kay was pleased at the tension among all the people there as they listened to him. A rustling rose from the silence which was more invigorating than the most ecstatic applause could have been. "There is no doubt," he said quietly, "that there is some enormous organization determining what is said by this court. In my case, this includes my arrest and the examination taking place here today. An organization that employs policemen who can be bribed, oafish supervisors, and judges of whom nothing better can be said than that they are not as arrogant as some others. This organization even maintains a high-level judiciary along with its train of countless servants, scribes, policemen, and all the other assistants that it needs. Perhaps even executioners and torturers. I'm not afraid of using those words. And what, gentlemen, is the purpose of this enormous organization? Its purpose is to arrest innocent people and wage pointless prosecutions against them which, as in my case, lead to no result. How are we to avoid those in office becoming deeply corrupt when everything is devoid of meaning? That is impossible. Not even the highest judge would be able to achieve that for himself. That is why policemen try to steal the clothes off the back of those they arrest. That is why supervisors break into the homes of people they do not know. That is why innocent people are humiliated in front of crowds rather than being given a proper trial. The policemen only talked about the warehouses where they put the property of those they arrest. I would like to see these warehouses where the hard-won possessions of people under arrest is left to decay, if, that is, it's not stolen by the thieving hands of the warehouse workers. K was interrupted by a screeching from the far end of the hall. He shaded his eyes to see that far, as the dull light of day made the smoke whitish and hard to see through. It was the washerwoman, whom Kay had recognized as a likely source of disturbance as soon as she had entered. It was hard to see now whether it was her fault or not. Kay could only see that a man had pulled her into a corner by the door and was pressing himself against her. But it was not her who was screaming, but the man. He had opened his mouth wide and looked up at the ceiling. A small circle had formed around the two of them. The visitors near him in the gallery seemed delighted that the serious tone Kay had introduced into the gathering had been disturbed in this way. Kay's first thought was to run over there, and he also thought that everyone would want to bring things back into order there, or at least to make the pair leave the room. But the first row of people in front of him stayed where they were. No one moved, and no one let Kay through. On the contrary, they stood in this way. Old men held out their arms in front of him, and a hand from somewhere, he did not have the time to turn round, took hold of his collar. Kay, by this time, had forgotten about the pair. It seemed to him that his freedom was being limited, as if his arrest was being taken seriously, and, without any thought for what he was doing, he jumped down from the podium. Now he stood face to face with the crowd. Had he judged the people properly? Had he put too much faith in the effect of his speech? Had they been putting up a pretense all the time he had been speaking, and now that he came to the end and to what must follow, were they tired of pretending? What faces they were all around him! Dark little eyes flickered here and there, cheeks drooped down like on drunken men. Their long beards were thin and stiff. If they took hold of them, it was more like they were making their hands into claws, not as if they were taking hold of their own beards. But underneath those beards, and this was the real discovery made by Kay, there were badges of various sizes and colors shining on the collars of their coats. As far as he could see, every one of them was wearing one of these badges. All of them belonged to the same group, even though they seemed to be divided to the right and the left of him. And when he suddenly turned round, he saw the same badge on the collar of the examining judge, who calmly looked down at him with his hands in his lap. "So," called out Kay, throwing his arms in the air as if this sudden realization needed more room, "all of you are working for this organization. I see now that you are all the very bunch of cheats and liars I've just been speaking about. You've all pressed yourselves in here in order to listen in and snoop on me. You gave the impression of having formed into factions. One of you even applauded me to test me out, and you wanted to learn how to trap an innocent man. Well, I hope you haven't come here for nothing. I hope you've either had some fun from someone who expected you to defend his innocence, or else let go of me. or I'll hit you, shouted Kay to a quivery old man who had pressed himself especially close to him, or else that you've actually learned something, and so I wish you good luck in your trade. He briskly took his hat from where it lay on the edge of the table, and, surrounded by a silence caused perhaps by the completeness of their surprise, pushed his way to the exit. However, the examining judge seems to have moved even more quickly than Kay, as he was waiting for him in the doorway. "One moment," he said. Kay stood where he was, but looked at the door with his hand already on the handle rather than at the judge. "I merely wanted to draw your attention," said the judge, "to something you seem not yet to be aware of. Today you have robbed yourself of the advantages that a hearing of this sort always gives to someone who is under arrest." Kay laughed towards the door. "You bunch of louts," he called. "You can keep all your hearings as a present from me." Then he opened the door and hurried down the steps. Behind him, the noise of the assembly rose as it became lively once more, and probably began to discuss these events as if making a scientific study of them. End of chapter 2. Okay, chapter 2. He now has a hearing for what he's being arrested for, and we still don't know what he's been arrested for, and we still don't know anything. We don't know anything, and it seems like nobody knows anything. So he's going to this place, and he realizes that he doesn't really know where he's going. He doesn't really know the building. He doesn't really know, the room, none of these things. And he recalls that, the guilty are able to find where they're going. And so he finds the staircase, and he goes from door to door, seemingly asking for Lance. Lance is the name of the landlady's cousin, who is a captain of a ship. Wild. So he's going door to door, and nobody is really telling him anything, and people are trying to help sometimes, and like leading him someplace else, and like trying another door, or trying like a completely other part of the building, like just wild. And so he finally gets to this one door, and a little girl answers, and he's like, "Is Lance here?" And the little girl points to the room across the hall, and so he goes over there and is like, "I was told that Lance would be here." And the woman brings him in, escorts him in, and the place is just crowded. It's so packed. And she's like, "Come on in, I need to close the door." And she closes the door, and this is where the hearing is. And it's so packed, and it looks like the room is divided into two different factions. And there is an advisor, and there's a judge, these two factions, and Joseph himself, and Joseph, who is K. And Joseph is, called up, and half of the group is applauding aggressively, and they're like cheering and applauding, and he's like, "Excellent, I have people on my side." And so he's going through and like saying all of the things, and he's like, "It seems like I'm only guilty if I acknowledge that I'm guilty, and I'm only acknowledging it for this one moment to make my point, but I'm not guilty of anything." And he's just going on and on and on, and talking about the authority, and like this faceless entity that is doing all of these things. And he's like, they hired this oafish supervisor, and these dumb police officers, and all of these things. And he's just going through all of these motions, and then he looks and he realizes that every single person in this room except for him has a badge. And he makes the realization, like, oh, every single person in this room is also working for this faceless organization. It's just like a wild dream. It is a nightmare, from looking from room to room and not really knowing where you're going, but somehow finding where you're going, to, trying to plead your case to all of these different people. And there's just nothing that anybody can tell you of what the charges actually are, but you're guilty and you're arrested. Is just wild. And I'm really enjoying it. That's going to be it for tonight. Thank you. I will somehow, some way get this onto something that I can hold because I feel so awkward just like scrolling. Like, it feels so silly. It feels like I'm not reading, even though I know that I am. I know, blah, blah, blah. But we'll continue right where we left off last time, or this time. We'll continue next time right where we left off this time. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, thank you. So as always, whether you lurk, whether you chat, I 1000% appreciate you. I 1000% appreciate your support. If I don't see you next time, I hope to see you very soon.